Hello, I'm Gina Clifford, and with my co-host, Louise Mowbray, we are in conversation. And today we are wrapping up 2023 by hosting our guest, Howard Fields, who is a very talented entrepreneur and wears many hats, and he's a valued collaborator. And today we are going to talk about our favorite books, books that have stuck with us over the years, so that as we end 2023 and look into 2024, we take ourselves out of our day to day, blinders on, focused thinking, and get inspired by some new ideas from some very different kinds of books and authors. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Louise, Howard.
Thanks, Gina. And what a great way to end an extraordinary year. And I think that what is so inspiring about this conversation to come, even if I'm predicting the next half an hour to an hour or so, is that all of the discussions that we've had leading up to this conversation between the three of us have been about how do we, authors, there is so much amazing wisdom and knowledge and insight to be gained from reading. And the big question is, what do we need for today and moving into the future? And I know we like to look at things in sort of 12-month cycles, a year, 364 or 5 days next year. However, of course, when something really sticks with us, it stays with us. It's enduring. It's timeless. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation and to discovering what stuck with you, and if there are any new books this year that have caught your attention. And you, Howard?
Well, for me, yeah, it was an interesting year, 2023. I know we're all anxious to jump ahead to 2024. Um, Careful what you wish for, I guess I would say. 2024 will bring probably more volatility than 2023 did, at least here in the U.S. and probably worldwide. I mean, we're dealing with all kinds of issues on a global basis that any one of them could flare up even more than they already have. And we could have a lot more military conflict next year. We could have a lot more political conflict in 2024. So careful what you wish for. It also makes the job of trying to anticipate what's going to happen a little bit harder because there's more data and there's more actors, I guess I would say, at work than perhaps we had this year. Clearly, the big story this year was AI and how we went from 2022, where everyone hated chatbots, to 2023, where everyone fell in love with chatbots. Um, and like any obsession, they do they do tend to quiesce over time. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out next year. And we've come through this cycle of things like Bitcoin and digital ledger and augmented reality and virtual reality, and now AI. We'll see what's excuse me, what's in the offing for 2024. As for authors, I tend to refer to the same books year after year after year. The lessons I learned from some of these great thinkers, um, many years ago, have stuck with me and basically helped me get through a long career, particularly in regard to emerging technology. So I think about Alvin Toffler and Future Shock, and as kind of the starting point for me on that. And for me, I love the classics, so that's what you'll hear me refer to as we have this conversation today.
Thanks, Howard. Gina, I think let's start off with top of your list this year?
So to start with, I don't think that my all-time favorite book that I have finished reading was written in 2023 or even 2022. But I will, like Howard said, I will talk about a book that is my all-time favorite. It's not a terribly new book, but it's not old either. It's kind of maybe in the mid 2011 and 2012 publishing timeframe. But it's one of those books that no matter when you read it, what's there helps you think about the future in a much more expansive way. And these folks don't consider themselves futurists. So my favorite book, and Louise, I think I've shared this with you, it is Design Unbound. It's written in 2 volumes. And actually, I think you used to be able to buy the chapters individually. I don't know if that is still the case, but it's my seminal book to look to whenever I'm thinking about trying to approach something with a new perspective, because Anne Pendleton Julian is an architect, and she's a very well spoken person. You know, she's a lecturer in universities, but when she puts the words into the book, as a futurist, you look at that and say, that's futures thinking. It's not sold as a futures thinking book. It's actually a book for the world, for people to think about using systems thinking, design thinking, futures thinking, design principles to solve tough problems. And I just want to read one little tiny excerpt from a chapter on world building, because that's part of one of these volumes in the book. And it starts off with, in cinema, world building is a completely new design and production paradigm. It brings together and minds from a diverse collection of imaginations. But instead of using designers and technical experts as consultants to the story, domain experts, designers, and writers are engaged to work from the beginning, envisioning the world and building these visions into a textured and coherent whole. If we want to extend the practice for other purposes, it is important to look at this process and its components. Beyond an understanding of how it works, its core concepts, it is important to look at how one actually does world building. And then they go into talking about how to do that. And that's really, really important in futures thinking. World building is kind of at the core of getting anyone to understand and appreciate another perspective. And it's using these tools. And, you know, this chapter is dedicated to those kinds of things. And then in another chapter, they go on to talk about systemic change and how that happens, and break it down and talk about all the different components that have to be there to create outsized systemic change anywhere in the world, and, you know, beyond a community, but have worldwide impact. So that this book is this series of books is really, really important to me. But I don't want to take up all of the time. So Louise, I want to hear what book, maybe it's not a new book, but what book has really stuck with you and is maybe your North Star when you need new thinking.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, you've shared that book with me, and it's hugely insightful and definitely something on my reading list. I think one of the key books that stood out for me this year is The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, who is the music producer. I think he's been certainly perfecting his craft for over 40 years, and worked with some of the the big names of our times. Probably more in recent years we think of Adele and people like that. But what is extraordinary about this book is that it's interwoven with what I would think of as a conscious leadership coach, as conscious awarenesses. And it's written in something like 400 bite-sized, I'm going to call them pieces. I'm not entirely sure. They're not, they're perhaps not chapters, but they are. They're kind of mini chapters. So literally you can dig in, and whatever your question or query is, or you can actually find something that suits the occasion. And I think creativity for me is probably one of the most fundamental things that we need today. And I don't know about you, but when I went to school, you were almost sort of streamed either into humanities and creativity, something creative, or something sort of leaning towards STEM. And, it was always sort of considered the bright students went towards the sciences or something along those lines, and everybody else got humanities. And, kind of dictated the degree you were able to do when you got to university. And I'll never forget sort of early working life in London in the investment banking sector. And I'd come across a whole bunch of people who'd studied, I don't know, English and history or something, and yet were investment bankers. And I just felt really shortchanged by the education system I'd come through. And, but still today, if I think about all of the years I've worked with top executives in many different countries and right across the sectors, this idea of creativity has been regaled to, that's for other people. That's something that other people do, like highly creative musicians or artists, or people don't understand that creativity could be looking at a balance sheet. My father always used to say that accountants, because he wanted me to become a chartered accountant, he'd often say, accountants are the most creative people on the planet because they get to play with numbers and create any reality they want. And I'll agree with him on playing with the numbers. The numbers didn't dance on the page like musical notes for me as they did for him. So this idea of, if we think about where we are today and what the next decade is likely to hold for all of us, we're really not being sages or sort of, prediction machines when we talk about the fact that the world has changed and will change inextricably in ways that we can't even begin to fathom, purely because of the convergence of the technologies that are already here. It's not as if they aren't here already, but I think a lot of us don't realize how life and business will change. When we look at creativity, it's probably the one, and things like intuition, which is really marrying reason and logic with our innate human ability to sense and perceive and understand and connect dots in ways that, perhaps an AI-driven system of some sort cannot do. And so when I think of creativity, and I work with the executives that I do and the leadership teams, it's probably the one thing that gives leaders and C-suite teams the edge, is tapping into this extraordinary ability that we all have. Ideas don't pop out of nowhere. They come out of the space in between. So yes, there's data and logic and all of that good stuff, and we're all kind of well trained in all of that. But then there's this other part of us, which is extraordinary. I'll just read you also a little passage that I've highlighted. And actually, I put this into my book under the chapter titled The Art and Science of Flow. And this is a section called The Creative Itch. So going back to Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being, he says, we are all antennae for creative thought. Some transmissions come on strong, others are more faint. If your antenna isn't sensitively tuned, you're likely to lose the data in the noise, particularly since signals coming through are often more subtle than the content we collect through sensory awareness. They are energetic more than tactile, intuitively perceived more than consciously recorded. And I think that one of the things that really heightened my understanding about creativity and intuition was some years ago when I co-founded an executive search firm at the time of .com. So that nicely puts me into an era going back. And the business that we had was purely focused on working with the venture capital community, the investment community of all sorts of varieties, and the startups of that time. And I'll never forget one early evening getting a message from one of the VCs, and we've been working with one of the startups, one of the tech teams, in terms of building their team according to funding milestones and all sorts of things, because they were due to invest in this company. And he sent me a little message and he said, please call me. And I did. And he said, I'm going to pull the plug on this. I'm just not sure about it. And I said, oh, why is that? I mean, they'd endless due diligence. I mean, they'd spent 18 months, 2 years working with this particular startup. And he said, something doesn't feel right. And he said, I'm going to sleep in it. And, we were due to meet the next morning. And he said, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And I got into the meeting and he canned this investment. And nobody was surprised. I mean, I think I was more surprised by the fact that nobody was surprised, that everybody was prepared to accept a decision based on some sort of feeling, a gut feeling, an intuition, some sort of creative space that it wasn't the right time for this, or it wasn't the right investment. And of course, sorely disappoint the founders of the startup. So that was the first time I kind of tuned into the value of tapping into intuition and creativity. So highly recommend Rick Rubin's book. I think that if you feel you're not creative enough in business, or you need to tap into that side of you that perhaps hasn't been nurtured, it's a great way to get the creative juices flowing. And yes, I'll ask the same of you, Howard.
Well, I could take that in a couple different directions, less so from a book I read standpoint, but from life. I remember when I first was a trainee for IBM back in the late 70s. I was at a class and we had to demonstrate our ability to make a presentation, a persuasive presentation. And my thesis was anyone can be creative. And so I haven't thought about that in many, many years. Somewhere there's a picture of me with a flip chart stand with the outline of that presentation. I just took a quick look, couldn't find it. But I've always believed that everyone has the potential to be creative. And at least for me, um, I find it as a way of marking events. So I think you both know I've been a songwriter along the way. And back about 25 years ago, I learned that one of my childhood friends, my closest childhood friend, had passed away, obviously far too young. And I wrote a song about how we met and whatever, and the song was called "In Memories." And I, I I was trying to make the point, to capture the point that it was the way he chose to live his life was part of the reason that he passed young. And I came up with this line that the choices we make every day seal our fate, right? And that line has always stuck with me as kind of one of those truisms in life that I was trying to capture so that others could think about it. And that song got it was never published, but it was recorded and it's been online and on YouTube and whatever. I've had people from high schools all across the US who have sent me messages saying, "Can we use this at our reunion? We have a classmate who this would apply to." I mean, I wrote that 25 years ago, and I still get those requests. And so all I'm saying is you you use creativity. I use creativity to mark moments in time that hopefully are more universal than just for me. And that's an example of how that plays out. That's a really personal example.
Howard, you did say that you had a couple books, though, that when you want to think differently or you want to help other people think differently, there were two books that you talked about that help
Yes.
jog new ideas. What are those books?
When we were planning on doing this discussion, I went and grabbed them off the bookshelf. So back at again in my corporate career, you run a lot of meetings and you're trying to find ways to get people to get out of their daily thought process. Um, so I found a couple of books by a gentleman by the name of Roger von Oech, Oech. And the first one is, I don't know if I can make this work. There we go. It's a whack on the side of the head. And it's a whole bunch of creative exercises that you can use with teams to get them thinking differently before you then go into the topic at hand. The other one came out a couple years later, and again, I can't do this really well. There we go. Kick in the seat of the pants. I always thought these titles, these titles were perfect for what you're trying to do, and to get people out of their daily mindset. Um, you'll get much better creativity to the point that we're on if you can get them to pause their usual thought process. I've applied this again over the years, uh, in focus groups, as an example. When I bring a bunch of people together, I learned very early on that if you ask them what they want next, they will look along today's performance curve on whatever it is that you're asking them about, and they will then, in essence, predict the next thing on that curve. But when you can get them out of their normal mindset and get them to think about new possibilities, um, you end up with answers that do not live on the existing performance curve. They actually change the slope, and you get some exponential thought, and that's really the goal of a lot of these exercises. So books like those two and others have taught me to take that approach and to drive greater creativity as a result of it.
I love how this conversation is finding a very deep creativity theme in it. And now I'm starting to think of books I wasn't prepared to talk about that aren't new books, but Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. And he talks about his life at Pixar and how Pixar, against the odds, continued hit after hit after hit of stories and how some of the secrets on how they get there. And for me, one of the things that comes out of it isn't that they have brilliant talent. Of course they do, but it doesn't really come down to just talent. And so, one quick thing that I remember, one quick anecdote from that book that shines on the culture that's creative culture that happens at Pixar. It's intentional, and that how it helps to shape that amazing product that they end up with time after time. And one of the things that Ed talks about is if you have a company and it's big enough that you have a cafeteria in your offices, don't outsource the cafeteria work. And he talks about why. It's like, well, first of all, if it's somebody that you contract with and they come in, they're going to make food as cheap as they can because they need to make a profit. If you bring somebody and you hire them as your employee, then they just want to be loved. They want everyone to love their food. So if you want your people to stay instead of going out to lunch somewhere and getting late, getting back because of traffic, then hire a chef as an employee of the company instead of outsourcing your food and they'll make it great. It'll be amazing food. People will want to stay, they'll want to sit, they'll want to collaborate, chat over lunch about work. And then there's a cohesion that happens in teams that doesn't happen when everybody goes their separate ways at lunch, late coming back, it's all fractured, their mindset is shifted. And then the other little nugget that I got from it is when they would have a meeting in a conference room, and the conference room was designed so that like maybe 12 people could sit around it. But the teams were bigger than that, maybe 20, 30 people. So you had rows of people sitting in the back and around the edges of the room. And the thing that was noticed was that the people that sat at the table were always the senior leaders, so the most senior people. So that those are the people that felt more empowered to talk. So new ideas that came from the newer people, the younger people or the newer people, never really percolated into the ideas in the room because they weren't sitting at the table. So they redesigned the rooms so that everybody was at the same level during a meeting and everyone was felt encouraged to speak. And so those are things that aren't innately thought of as part of creativity, but those are ways that companies can actually tap into their people and spur creativity, enable it. So,
So
you know,
I want to
yeah.
pick up on that a little bit because what you're describing for me is a technique that's part of being creative, which is being counterintuitive. Whatever the belief is today, whatever the discussion in the room, wherever it's leaning, if you take a counterintuitive approach to it, right? I used to call it oblique thinking, right? The room is moving one way, you move 180 degrees the other way to test, right? To test whether the room is absolutely convinced or to open up a discussion about other possibilities. And and being counterintuitive in a discussion is real for me. It's a technique that I have used quite a bit over the course of my career, and it drives creative thinking when you do that.
I think there's a fundamental underlying thing to all of this, and that is the conscious awareness of the people making the decisions about opening a room up, or perhaps thinking in the way that
Yeah,
you've described. So it needs a level of conscious awareness without which these types of decisions just would not be made. So we always need to go down a level, or broader level, or upper level, or whatever you want to call it. We need to break out of because if you think about it, and actually one of the things that I've started during the pandemic and then reconstituted it into a different format was creating a situation for every person to be heard in a team engagement. And I think what you're saying, Howard, is so important, because the best ideas, if we look at innovation and ideation and what that's sort of which we've heard so much about. In fact, pre AI popping with ChatGPT just over a year ago, it was just about all we heard about for the preceding years. And yet, if we think about this sort of constant debate about, where do ideas come from and how do they land and how do they, without the right conditions, affordances, and constraints in an organization, and leaders understanding the play of these things, the dynamic play of these things, and how they're constantly changing. So the complexity involved and the systems that they represent and the knock-on impact of one thing on another. That's fundamental to this kind of creative thinking. So our best ideas almost always come from left field, where we might least expect them. And often that might be the person that is never heard, or the person sitting on the edges or on the stairs at the back of the room, or whatever it might be. And it's just the nature of humanity that some people feel that they are able to be spoke. The danger is, of course, when we go beyond listening and we've forgotten how to listen, and we are better at spreading our ideas than actually listening to that wonderful little voice of creativity somewhere in the left field. And we can't end this portion of our discussion without, of course, mentioning The Artist's Way, another book that, as you said, Gina, that these things start popping the minute we start discussing a certain topic. But The Artist's Way, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity by Julia Cameron. And she had such an interesting story. She was married to Martin Scorsese, and she lost her way and descended into sort of a Hollywood spiral, downward spiral of addiction. And she got clean and sober using the AA 12-step process. And her book has sold, 4 million copies. But the interesting thing about it, her book, is that during the pandemic in 2020, her book sales doubled by mid-year. So obviously, during that time we were sort of locked away and unable to get out there. People obviously, well, that was in the UK anyway, her book sales doubled. People obviously felt the need to try and tap into their innate creativity, which may have been lost in the noise of innovation and ideation in the perhaps preceding 5 years or so. And interestingly, the author Elizabeth Gilbert said, without the artist's way, there would have been no Eat, Pray, Love. So I think, that book has inspired so much for so many people. So how do we build a bridge from creativity to what's next? Gina, will you take us?
Well, before we leave this, I want to make two more points about the counterintuitiveness driving other things. First of all, you see this come out all the time. Let's pick a newer book, The Jolt Effect by Matthew Dixon and Ted McKenna. This is a book for salespeople, right? That teaches the point that salespeople have it kind of wrong in their head. It's not about getting a customer committed by showing them how they're going to succeed by buying the product and implementing the solution, but rather it's about how to prevent failure. That's what the buyer cares about. So we've talked about the counterintuitiveness in a creative sense. It applies in a business sense very, very directly when you look at a book like that. The other point that I would want to close out on is that we talk about this in very glowing terms: creativity and thinking differently. You do have to recognize that if you're going to play that role, particularly in a company, if you're going to be someone who leads paradigm shifts, um, it's sometimes a rough road to hoe.
Always.
I got a book. It's an old book by Joel Barker, who's was a consultant that I worked with probably 40 years ago now. He's still around out in the Midwest, but he talked about the 4 kinds of people that lead these paradigm shifts. The first is the kid out of college who doesn't know the problem can't be solved and solves it. Then there's the tinkerer, the guy or gal who's been around for 40 years, who's been working on a problem and finally solves it. Then there's the person who changes domains. So maybe somebody from finance moves over to marketing and brings a more metric oriented perspective and changes how marketing functions. And most people in companies are okay with those folks because they're kind of anomalies. They happen, right? But the person they like the least who drives change is the person who is successful in the current paradigm, but spots earlier that it's starting to fail and that it's going to fail more over time and wants to get ahead of it. They despise that person because that person is upending the power base in a company often when they come up with the change or the paradigm shift that's necessary. And so all I'm saying is if you're going to be the person in the room who's driving the counterintuitive thinking or always trying to get people to contribute who are perhaps more introverted, it's not always fun. But
what was the
it
name
is
of that book,
rewarding.
Howard? What is
The
that
Joel
book?
Barker book is called Future Edge. I think it's still in print. He wrote a couple back in the day that talked about these. And again, in 1980, I was just starting my career, and so uh, this was like music to my ears that you could actually understand how to position these things better so you could be heard. And for me, at least, I had one boss. He appraised me one day. He started out by saying, "Howard, you know what? I often don't like what you say, but I do know when you say it that you're telling me what you truly believe." And I looked at him and I said, "Thank you. That is my goal, to be seen that way. But isn't it a shame that that's such a valuable commodity? It should be de rigueur, not exceptional." And that's how I've always felt about this. Everybody can and everybody should contribute to looking ahead. Let's just call it looking ahead. So anyway, I just wanted to make those 2 points before we closed out this part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to segue into the next thing. And I've been thinking about this for a little bit. And I want to challenge both of you on the spot to come up with 3 books, preferably that you read this year, newer books that maybe were published this year or that you read this year, that you would point to for others to say, if you want to think differently in 2024, you should look at these 3 books. And I will start with mine so that you have a few minutes to think about the 3 books that you would put forward to help people think differently about 2020 in 2024. And I want to start with, of course, Louise's lovely new book, Irrelevant, which I have a copy here and I am working through it, but I don't know how it's not really showing up on the
No,
camera
we're not
very
getting
well.
it. Thank you, Gina.
But this book, Louise, I've had a little sneak preview of it throughout you writing it, and I hear your voice so deeply in it that I can't wait to finish reading it because every time we talk, and this conversation is a great example, get so many new ideas just start popping in my brain because you've had so many different experiences in your life, and you've traveled around the world, and you've seen different cultures, and you understand what makes humanity the same instead of what's different about us. And you kind of started to coalesce some of those wisdoms about what makes us human and start to value those things in ourselves as leaders. And so many business books miss that. They go for like 5 steps to, conquering the world kind of thing. And it's just takes away all the humanity. It's just about action and workshops, and that stuff is important. But you can't forget about the things that make a difference in our companies as people. They create the culture. They shape the culture, and tapping into that is like tapping into what everybody's going crazy about ChatGPT. It's so powerful, but I would argue that tapping into your people's mindsets and their cohesion and their culture, capturing the essence of their ingenuity, is beyond anything ChatGPT will give us. And I truly believe that. And I think you go there in your book in a way that I haven't seen. It's very refreshing for leaders to think differently in 2024 about leading. So that's my first book that I would recommend to everyone this next year to read, and it's published just this past month, so it's brand new, hot off the press, fresh, not well read yet. So everybody has the opportunity for that one to be first out of the gate to talk about these different ways of thinking.
Repeat the
Um,
title again, please, Gina.
Irrelevant, future-focused leadership. Resist, adapt, follow lead, survive, thrive by Louise Mowbray. And highly recommend you order it on Amazon. You'll get it the next day, or you can even get the digital version. So I highly recommend that book. And digging into it now, but I've read through summaries and things with Louise, so I know it's an amazing book. The other book that I think is a seminal book for anyone that wants to have a rethink about how they think about the world is Sapiens, which is not. It's a very common book, right? Everyone's probably heard of Noah Yuval Harari. He writes about humanity through history, but he brings in so much research and pulls it all together into a compelling narrative that you won't want to put the book down. But it really helped reshape some of the things that I believed, really questioned a lot of my assumptions about the world, and gave me another way of thinking about things. And thought that was really, really powerful. And like I said, I don't want to talk too much about that book because it's all over everybody's book lists all the time. It's not a new book, but it's one of the books that I think is one of the most powerful books that I've ever read. And if I had to throw a third book in there, it was published, I believe, in 2023, and it wasn't my favorite book because in parts of it were hard to get through. It was a little dry, and storytelling was a little rough, but it was Ministry of the Future. And that book is what's glorious about it is, the worst has happened in climate change, and it's a fictional book, but it feels like it could be happening in the near future. It's very much bounded in near term future Earth. But the economic models that the author brings forward are really interesting and thought-provoking in a way that takes you out of your mindset of this is the way the world works, this is the way it always worked, and this is the way it always will work. It takes you completely out of that, and it helps you think about things in dramatically different ways that you hadn't considered. So if you can get through some of the patchy storytelling parts of it, it's worth a read just from the nerdy perspective of wanting different perspectives on future economic models and future models of climate change, for better or worse. I'll say it that way. And those are my three. So I want to turn it over to you, Louise, and then Howard, hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, it's I must pick that book up again, The Ministry of the Future. I kind of dipped in and dipped out, and this year has been a bit of a strange one for me because I've dipped into things and taken what I'd needed and then moved on. But there is one particular book which I only came across a few months ago, but was published in 2019 by Dr. Tara Swart, called The Source. And I'm just going to have a little look and see if I can find the subtitle to share it with you. Open Your Mind, Change Your Life. And what I loved about this book is that she is a neuroscientist. And so very much that sort of science background, a doctor, psychiatrist, and spent many years dealing with, in her words, one very sick person at a time, and felt this calling to actually have a greater impact on the world, and moved into corporate and retrained as an executive coach. But what I find really fascinating about her book is she's taken all of the wisdoms and the woo-woos and the intuitive stuff and the stuff about sort of creating the future that we want. We often talk about it. And yes, there are lots of business models and frameworks and tools and endless stuff that we can follow to get there, kind of a roadmap. But very few people talk about the way that we need to think in order to do those things or be those things rather than, so everybody focuses on the doing rather than the being driving the doing. And as you know, everything I do in business is helping people to really expand on the being that drives the doing so that it's effortless and in the right direction. And what I found fascinating about this particular book, I think it might be her third book, is that she's sort of deconstructed. I guess if we think of the book The Secret, if I say The Secret, it's probably enough to put anybody off reading this. She deconstructed all of the woo stuff out of The Secret and matched up with the neuroscience. So what works? How does it actually work? How can we work with our own neuroplasticity to create the life and the business and, achieve the things that we want to achieve? Using our own understanding of how our brains, our minds, our bodies work. And, just kind of decodes all of that. And I love it when science meets wisdom. It's a little like epigenetics. All the stuff our grandparents told us about, most of it anyway, is proving to be true today. So anything that helps people to understand themselves better and to be able to create the neural pathways that enable them to achieve what they're looking to achieve, for me, is always a winner. And the way that she explains things is just so clear and really, it's definitely not so positive that you just think it's a sort of, toxic positivity, way too much of that. It's very down to earth and based on science. So I think that satisfies a lot of, and I always try these things with my clients. If it works, we get a resounding yes. So that book has got a resounding yes from everyone. And then just thinking of the other books that I've kind of dipped into this year, one of the books that I think is definitely worth tapping into, and I'm definitely moving along the lines of energy here and and wisdoms and creativity, because they, for me, hold so much weight in terms of what the next year, the next decade holds for all of us, is a book by the name of Energy Rules, and it's by a woman by the name of Alla. You're gonna have to forgive my pronunciation here. Stravinskaya, I think. She's such an interesting woman. She trained as a medical doctor. I think, comes from um, 5 generations of healers in her family, and she was the first to take a medical degree and combine this healing capability, this understanding of how energy works. And if I sort of think back to many years ago, when I used to talk to clients about energy, I talk about physics, you know, because it was probably easier for most people to wrap their heads around. And today, I think we can be a little bit more liberal in talking about energy. So even if we think of simple stuff, Howard, back to your sales examples, or how to read a room. We often talk about executive presence and impact. Well, what does that actually mean? It means the energy that we arrive with, and how we're able to bring an energy up in a room or move it in a direction. And often we don't think about those things, and yet it's innately human. Some people seem to have the knack to, and there have been endless books written about executive presence and impact. But what is that thing? What is that elusive thing? And for me, the definition of leadership has always been why people follow you, or why they choose to follow you. You can't proclaim leader and have no one follow. Well, you can. I mean, it's happened many times in history. But of course, the ones that are able to lead a movement, lead a change in an organization, as you talked about, how those anomalies, those extraordinary people, somehow are able to corral that energy and provoke something different. And I think, understanding it from an energy perspective, think of it as physics if you prefer. It depends what language people enjoy. It's the same stuff. So how do we do that for ourselves? Do it for our teams and our organizations? How do we inspire it in other people? And how do we ensure that we are holding that executive presence and impact ourselves in ways that actually work for us and for the people around us, and of course for our organizations. So I'm going to stop at that, because I think that there are a couple of other books I've read this year. Some I've sort of abandoned early on, but I don't want to give anyone a bad rap. So I'll leave it at that and pass it over to you, Howard.
Thank you, Louise. That last comment about about energy and leadership, it made me stop and think. I actually think that this ties back into the human versus AI discussions that we've had all this year. Um, Recently, I had the fortunate opportunity to go to my 50th high school reunion, and my nickname was the Mayor, because I have kept in touch with so many people over the years. One of my best friends and I started the Facebook group for the class back in 2007. So we've done a lot to keep everybody in touch. And your comment about, what creates leadership, um, it keeps driving me back to human relationships and authenticity, and you're just caring enough about people, which is a total antithesis to a lot of what we're trying to do to drive productivity with AI. And I think that's where the debate's going to be over the next couple of years. How much can you actually move away from authenticity to stuff that's created by a machine? So I like that. I like you calling it energy, but I do translate that into spending my energy to reach out and touch people on an ongoing basis, and to maintain relationships. And nobody else, I shouldn't say no one else does, but few people make those efforts.
Do you have books that you recommend that we look
I
at?
can't talk on this, but I just wanted to catch that point on what Louise triggered. I do have some books that I would recommend though, that I've looked at this year. I don't think any of them were published this year. I'm sure they were published in the last two or three. So the first one I would cite is a book called Curmudgeon, and awkward title, but it's how to succeed as an industry analyst. And the reason I point to that, but it's written by Richard Steinen, Stienon, and he's a former Gartner analyst. He's been an analyst for many years, but it gives you the framework for how to be hard headed and challenge, um, you know, statements that people are making, so that you're getting to the real differentiators. And to me, this is all part of that, almost being counterintuitive. The whole world says this is great, but as an analyst, you have to then take it apart and say, okay, maybe this aspect of it is great, but this other aspect of it isn't so great. You need to really have divergent thinking that way. So that's one book I would recommend, and I guess you'll pick up a theme from this list of books, right? The next one is "You Are What You Risk," and it's by Michelle Wucker, Wucker. And it's this, the discussion we had earlier about the introverted people in the room that are perhaps, I don't want to say shouted down, but the extroverts kind of suck all the air out of the room. People need to learn that it's okay to take thoughtful risk, to stick your hand up and say, here's an idea, here's a concept, here's something that's wrong, we need to change. And this book is very, very helpful in helping you understand why you view risk the way you do as an individual, and how you can either leverage that or modify your behavior somewhat. And then the
Mm,
last one, I'm sure we've talked about in other conversations. It's "Be Less Zombie,"
yes.
right? How great companies create dynamic innovation, fearless leadership, and passionate people. And again, you can see the theme that I've got here is that everyone, for companies to succeed in a constantly changing world with increasing levels of uncertainty, right? You need your people to care. And I would say I've seen plenty of articles about that this year, that, we had quiet quitting and we had a whole bunch of other things where it's stated that people don't care as much. Well, everything's a pendulum, at least in my life. And so if it was that way this year, it's going to move back to people looking for places they can have an impact and be passionate. And so this book is by Elvin Turner, and it was published in 2020. It's a great book to help you think about that. And I would be remiss if I didn't add one more book, and it's the book that we started with, Gina. Right? So relevant. Louise's book. Uh, I had done I'd given her a quote for the book, and I call it a clear-eyed framework designed to help you differentiate and increase your personal and organizational value. And a lot of the things that I'm suggesting with these other books, she gives you techniques and ways to look at things that will help you move in those directions. So that's my list of books for this discussion.
I just wanted to tag on to what you said about Be Less Zombie, because I did also read that book, Howard. It's on my list as well. And what I like about Elvin's approach is that it's not so theoretical that you can't see how to apply what he's saying. And he actually has a part of a chapter on futurist thinking and strategic thinking, but he doesn't use a lot of futurist words. So you
Right.
may not recognize it if you're not a futurist, but his thinking is so relevant, right, for even though it was written several years ago, it's never more relevant, because he's focused on innovation and how do you tap into, again, how do you tap into people like Louise does in her book? How do you tap into what makes humanity great? And and then what he does is he also gives you practical step by step. Here's how you do it. So you don't have to feel like you're an expert in any of these things to start doing them. So yeah, I like that book.
Yeah, I would use the word pragmatic to describe a lot of the techniques.
You mentioned something about caring, Howard, that this particular book talks about actually caring, giving a damn, perhaps, and quiet quitting. And for me, it doesn't really correlate to quiet quitting. I think that we became untethered from the ties that bind us. This trust deficit created by how our perceived leaders at the time behaved, and the shift in terms of our anchor, into organizations to provide our full-on security when often they failed to do so during a very difficult time. But I loved what you said about caring, because one of the interesting things, we started off with creativity, and really creativity comes out of a state of being in flow. And if I think of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I don't know if you remember that book.
Oh, that's a classic.
It's going back a way. Robert Pirsig, I think it is. Forgive me on the memory there. But really, if we look at really what is caring, it's about being in a state of flow where we're actually deeply connected to what it is that we're doing. We have the sense of caring. And in fact, we don't sense anything at all. It's the absence of the thinking mind. And that's the root, that's the space that ideas emerge from, this innate creativity and this ability to think in different ways that has been the profound foundation of our discussion today, which has been incredible that it went in that direction. But yeah,
it's interesting. Let me build on that one level further, back to the counterintuitive point earlier. People only argue about things they care about. So when you have a customer complaint, right? How do most companies treat it? It's how do we dispense with this complaint? How do we, maybe it's we'll pay the customer off to make them, get them back to neutral on satisfaction. But the savviest companies realize there's gold in their hills, right? That when somebody's complaining, if you dissect it and figure out what's wrong, you can probably solve that same problem for many customers. Not a lot of companies get that. I just went through another one the other day, and I won't go through the example, but it just never ceases to amaze me how we don't understand that people who complain are people who care, and in many cases they're customers, not employees. And maybe your employee cares about solving that customer's problem, but you haven't given them the empowerment to do so. And so now you end up with both your customer and your employee dissatisfied. It's potentially a real lose-lose for companies. Anyway, I don't want to start a whole nother discussion, but that brings us back to the counterintuitive nature of a lot of this stuff that we were talking about.
And there's something to be said about the fact that a lot of this would be intuitive if people actually tapped into, that little whisper, the voice of truth, the little vision of what might happen. But then, of course, we have all of the trappings of position and perceived ideas of what leaders should be, or, act in certain ways. And I think often that intuitive action gets drowned out. And I also think a lot of leaders get to a point where they're not listening anymore. There's something to be said, as you said, Howard. Listening to the customer, there is gold in that. I mean, minds and minds of it, right? But we, in the same way that we might focus on listening to customers and have a program or models and tools and frameworks for the smart companies around that. And I know it's something you know particularly well, Howard. I think sometimes people just forget to care and to listen, and there is gold in that. And often the greatest talent, best ideas, innovations, all the stuff we're looking for in our organizations can only be heard if we tune in and listen and mine the gold that is already there. There is so much wisdom in our organizations if we choose to give it a platform and to hear it.
I'd like to recommend a book that follows along that line very well. It's probably you both have heard about it, maybe you've read it. It's called Start With Why by Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
And it gets to the why, which is, why are we doing this? Why do we exist as a company? Why do we want to do this as employees? And if you don't start with what's motivating people to do something, then everything else is just a checking the box, right? Because people aren't invested in it. And I really think that's more powerful than the book gets credit for. I think a lot of people maybe look at it as a little woo-woo, but I think when you think about this thread that we've talked about, creativity and tapping into human potential, the why is the biggest reason to get up in the morning for everybody. Why are they doing what they're doing? Why did they pursue this career? Why are they staying at your company? Why are they pushing on that flywheel to kind of move things forward? There's something that's feeding their soul. So feed it some more and get more of that. So it's a win-win for people and for organizations. So I think that I think that book is a perfect underline to the theme that we've just discussed.
I love what you just said, Gina. Yeah, there's a it always makes me laugh because we measure productivity and we measure engagement in organizations. I mean, that's the typical scenario. And I've yet to hear of a human being who puts their head down on the pillow at night next to their partner and gazes lovingly into their eyes and said, "I was so engaged today." I mean, it's just never happens. It's I hate my boss or I just love what I'm up to and I really, really got this amazing, this thing that I'm loving or not, or something in the middle, kind of a bit of meh. So
Well, this goes back to so many other books, right? Right. It's all about the journey, right? It's like, to order your word, flow, right? When you get in the flow of creating, of changing, of transforming, you feel like you're making progress. You feel like you're gaining on things as opposed to falling further behind. And whatever words we choose to describe this, how many countless books have referred to this in some way, whether they be business books or fiction or whatever. So yeah, it's a universal truth.
absolutely. So I think that leads us to we could pick another topic and do this again tomorrow, without a doubt. Thank you, Gina. Just wonderful and hard. It's amazing to get all of this wisdom and knowledge in one room. And I think it's definitely something worth picking up on, perhaps even once a quarter or a couple of times a year, just to have a look at the books that are actually having an impact on our thinking. And of course, the end of the day, hopefully it gives somebody else some inspiration um, to do the same. And I'm looking forward to hearing other people's suggestions once they've tapped into this. So thank you.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you
you, Louise.
for leading us through this. I think this is the first time I've been in this discussion with you all, although we've had many individual and private discussions over the last couple of years. I would remind us that we come from a certain generational cohort in our discussion of these things. And because of that, we have a particular vantage point. And I think one of the cool things about this is we can share the things that we've learned over decades with people who are earlier in their careers, and hopefully encourage them to be more. I don't want to use the word engaged, but more passionate might be the right way to say it, about what they're working on and about how they approach it. So anyway, that's my hope for these kinds of discussions.
Yeah, well said, Howard. Thank you. I appreciate you bringing that point out because I think about books that I've read that have influenced me. A lot of it's fiction that was written 100 years before I was born. Some of those books are still some of my favorite books. The Time
Right.
Machine, H.G. Wells.
Wow.
That's a timeless book that anyone could read at any time and still get the lessons out of it. So, yeah, kudos to you for identifying that the value that we bring through our little cohort here.
All right. Thank you both. It's a pleasure spending some time with you. I wish you both a very happy new year. And I'm sure we'll be discussing more in the new year.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so am I. Thank you.